Tomorrow I'm going to win my first race with Ferrari. Explosive statement from Hamilton after Austrian Grand Prix qualifying. Subscribe just to stay tuned for the Formula One news no one else explains to you. The entire mood across the Styrian Hills had undergone an unmistakable transformation by the time the final minutes of qualifying ticked away under the golden Austrian sun. There was a weight in the air, not ominous, but thick with anticipation, charged with something powerful and unspoken. In the paddock, where engineers exchanged hurried glances and mechanics moved with twitchy precision, there was a subtle but collective shift in attention. In the garages, where telemetry danced across dozens of monitors and radio chatter crackled between pit walls and cars, there was a growing awareness that something had altered. In the stands, where fans waved flags and donned their favorite team colors, many felt it without quite knowing why. And at the very heart of it all, there stood Lewis Hamilton, not louder, not flashier, not more animated than usual, but unmistakably changed. It wasn't in the obvious things. His walk retained its calm authority, and the wave he gave to the fans lining the fences still carried that familiar warmth. His answers to the media were as composed and thoughtful as ever. But underneath it all, beneath the performance, behind the ritual, there was something far more elemental. It was in his stillness, in the unshakable steadiness of his eyes, in the way his shoulders carried not the burden of expectations, but the readiness of someone who had just found the gear he'd been missing all year, mentally, emotionally, technically. There was a hum inside him now. A deep, vibrating pulse that said, "This is it." The story of Hamilton's journey through the early part of the season had been one of shadowboxing, fighting not just with rivals on the track, but with variables inside his own garage. Lingering balance issues, aerodynamic inconsistencies, energy deployment glitches, tire warm-up problems, mistrust in the simulator data, a growing, gnawing suspicion that he had been sold a vision that hadn't yet materialized. Each weekend had been a game of correction, plugging holes, adjusting compromises, trying to bring the SF-25 in line with his legendary precision. But it had always felt like something was missing. Until now. This time, something had clicked. And not through chance or blind luck. It was the result of a relentless, almost obsessive pursuit of alignment. In the week leading up to Spielberg, Hamilton had spent extra hours in the simulator facility in Maranello, dissecting every run, re-examining every braking phase and throttle application. He had gone deep into historical data from past Austrian Grand Prix, cross-referencing it with this year's aerodynamic package and real-time tire behavior. He had pushed his engineering team hard, not with frustration, but with urgency and clarity. He demanded more from the floor stiffness, from the rear suspension articulation, from the ERS logic mapping. He rejected 3 proposed setup directions before Friday morning, insisting on a 4th configuration that mirrored his 2020 Silverstone preferences. And it paid off. The moment he exited the garage for Q1, he felt it. The car rotated sharply but without suddenness through turns 1 and 3. The balance was neutral but reactive. The power delivery smoothed out along the climb to turn 4. The grip wasn't just present, it was predictable, inviting him to lean harder into the corners with each successive lap. For the first time since putting on the Scarlet Red, he wasn't managing weaknesses, he was exploiting strengths. Through Q2, he pushed even harder, his radio comms minimal but decisive. Rear's stable now. Can take more rotation at apex. ERS logic is perfect. That last one, particularly, was telling. The same system that had betrayed him in earlier races, deploying energy inconsistently, cutting too early on straights, undermining his acceleration in key sectors, was now behaving like a precision instrument. It was matching his inputs with uncanny fidelity, delivering power exactly where he asked for it, when he needed it most. By the time Q3 rolled around, the track was at its peak. Rubber had been laid down. The temperature had stabilized. The wind had calmed. The final run would decide everything. Charles Leclerc had already put in a flyer, and Max Verstappen was lurking with a time that looked unbeatable. But Hamilton, now more connected to the machine than he had been all season, was ready for something more than just a solid lap. What followed wasn't just a qualifying lap. It was a statement. Each corner was carved with intent. He braked later than anyone into turn 3 but carried apex speed without understeer. The rear didn't dance, it stuck. On the downhill plunge to turn 4, the traction was so clean that his exit speed surprised even the engineers watching live data. Through the sweeping middle sector, He kept the car within millimeters of perfection, adjusting only with micro-corrections on the steering wheel. And on the final straight, with ERS giving him full deployment, he surged across the line, not to pole, but to something perhaps even more powerful: second place, only fractions behind Verstappen, and ahead of every other Ferrari-powered car. When he stepped out of the SF-25, visor lifted, helmet pulled off, what shone through wasn't relief or arrogance. It was conviction. For the first time since signing that controversial legacy-defining contract with Ferrari, Hamilton knew, truly knew, that the dream was real. Not an illusion crafted by marketing teams. Not a story to satisfy journalists. But a tangible, ferocious belief grounded in performance. The kind of belief that grows only when a driver and machine reach true synchronicity. His post-qualifying interview was short, but it landed like thunder. "I finally feel it," he said to the swarm of microphones. Reporters still scrambling to grasp the gravity of what they had just seen. "For the first time since joining this team, I believe I can win. Not someday. Tomorrow." There was no bravado. No media spin. The words weren't rehearsed. They were raw, electric, born from experience and conviction. And the paddock felt it. Every rival, every strategist, every team principal watching from their pit walls saw something shift. Hamilton wasn't just competitive again. He was dangerous again. In the minutes that followed, back in the Ferrari motorhome, Hamilton spent time reviewing the onboard footage, surrounded by his engineer and performance analyst. They moved in quiet, efficient unison, like musicians who had finally found the right tempo. The setup notes were minimal: a slight tweak to front wing flap angle, a whisper of camber adjustment. No major changes were necessary. That in itself was a victory. The mechanics, often stoic and hardened by the grind of the calendar, exchanged glances that carried something close to hope. They had seen it. They had felt it. This wasn't just a flash of brilliance. This was the beginning of something cohesive, something rising. Hamilton's physiotherapist handed him a protein shake as he sat down for his debrief, but he didn't touch it for a long moment. He was staring out through the glass wall of the motorhome, looking down the pit lane where fans were still chanting his name, where the Austrian evening sky was bleeding orange and red across the horizon. His mind wasn't on celebration. It was on Sunday. He wasn't thinking about podiums. He wasn't calculating tire degradation or start procedures just yet. He was thinking about pressure, momentum, the feeling of a car that finally no longer needed to be tamed or translated, but simply driven. And he knew, when everything clicks, when machinery becomes extension, when mind and metal merge into one unstoppable force, that's when you become truly dangerous. Not just fast. The storm wasn't coming. It had already begun. Behind the reinforced walls of the Ferrari garage, long after the final Q3 laps had been clocked and the dust had metaphorically settled, a wave of subdued applause rolled through the team. Mechanics exchanged nods, a few brief handshakes, and polite pats on the back made their rounds. It was a scene of cautious satisfaction, not the unrestrained euphoria of a pole position lockout or a dominant 1-2. No champagne was popped, no wild cheers erupted. Because although the SF-24 had performed decently in qualifying, and Lewis Hamilton had placed the car higher than expected on the timesheets, a shadow hung heavy over the evening, and its name was Charles Leclerc. The Monegasque driver, usually a magnetic center of energy within the red-clad walls of Scuderia Ferrari, sat off to the side, expression unreadable, his body language closed, contemplative, restrained. His helmet, still perched on the table beside him, reflected the cold LED lights above, untouched since he had removed it in near silence just moments after stepping out of the cockpit. A steward's decision handed down during the second qualifying session had dealt a brutal blow to his weekend. After unintentionally obstructing another car on a flying lap, a marginal incident that in other circumstances might have earned only a warning, Leclerc had been handed a 5-place grid penalty. On paper, it was a procedural call. In reality, it was a dagger to the heart of a driver already balancing on the fine edge of competitive desperation and internal conflict. The infraction itself stemmed from a miscommunication on the radio. His race engineer had been a few seconds too late warning him of the approaching car. Charles had slowed through the racing line without realizing another driver was mid-push lap. A simple mistake. An honest one. But in Formula One, intentions are irrelevant. Only outcomes matter. And this outcome meant he would fall from a second-row start to the midfield melee, a battlefield where risk outweighs reward and chaos is more likely than clean overtakes. He didn't protest. Not outwardly. He didn't confront the stewards, didn't bark at the engineers, didn't unleash frustration into the garage radios. He was too seasoned for that. Instead, his silence screamed louder than any outburst. Those who knew him best, his performance coach, his race engineer, even the tire technicians who prepped his sets, could feel the storm beneath the surface. His replies were clipped. His eyes were dark with calculation. His fingers tapped rhythmically against the telemetry tablet he barely seemed to be reading. Every movement carried tension, like a rubber band pulled taut. But what stung more than the penalty, more than the injustice of it, more than the tactical disadvantage it imposed, was the man who now stood as Ferrari's fastest, Lewis Hamilton. The 7-time world champion, the icon whose arrival in Maranello had set the sport ablaze with anticipation, had just outqualified him. Not by a tenth. Not by luck. But with clarity and force. Lewis had extracted something from the car that few thought possible after the erratic performances of the early season. And more than that, he was glowing. There was a particular way Hamilton walked after a strong session. A calm confidence in his stride, shoulders loose, face relaxed, but eyes sharper than ever. He laughed easily. He engaged with every crew member, from the lead aerodynamicist to the coffee server, as if he were floating on air. His mannerisms didn't shout supremacy, they whispered it. And for Leclerc, watching from the edge of the room, it was a punch to the gut. Because it wasn't just about being outpaced. It was about being eclipsed. On his turf. Inside his team. During the debrief, the awkwardness was palpable. Hamilton offered detailed feedback, balancing praise and critique with practiced precision. His observations were incisive. His tone was upbeat, yet grounded. He made a light-hearted remark about having a real shot at the win tomorrow if we nail turn 3 on lap 1. And when a few engineers chuckled, Charles remained motionless. He didn't smile. Didn't lift his head. Just stared blankly at his datasheet, the screen's reflection illuminating his furrowed brow. When his turn came to speak, his analysis was brief, generic. No emotion. No insight. Just enough to fulfill the obligation. The entire room, though filled with sound, felt mute. The space between the two drivers stretched like an invisible chasm. There were no raised voices. No sharp words exchanged. But the silence between them weighed heavier than any verbal clash. Technicians pretended not to notice. Staff shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Interns looked at the floor. Everyone knew tension when they breathed it. As the media frenzy outside began to wane, and the floodlights over the Spielberg paddock softened into a dusk-stained orange, the Ferrari motorhome became a hushed sanctuary of reflection. Reporters packed up. Cameras stopped rolling. VIPs trickled out. The pace of movement slowed to a gentle crawl, as if the entire paddock was collectively exhaling after a long, emotionally charged day. Lewis found himself in a quiet lounge area tucked away at the far end of the team's motorhome. It was elegantly designed, with cream leather couches, ambient lighting, and a panoramic window that overlooked the alpine silhouettes in the distance. He eased himself into the seat, finally away from the cameras, the questions, the comparisons. For a moment, he simply sat there, absorbing everything. The car had finally responded to him. Not resisted. Not fought. It had flown. Moments later, Frédéric Vasseur, the man tasked with steering the chaotic ship that was Ferrari in this new Hamilton-Leclerc era, entered the room. His expression was neutral but observant. Vasseur had watched every lap from the pit wall, headset on, brow furrowed, his foot rhythmically tapping against the concrete beneath him. He didn't speak immediately. He approached slowly, took the seat across from Lewis, and offered a bottle of chilled mineral water. No words, just a gesture of respect and recognition. Only once the bottle was opened and a moment of shared silence passed did he finally say something. That, Vasseur murmured, voice low and steady, was special. Hamilton looked up. His face didn't beam with ego. It softened into something rarer, satisfaction without arrogance. It felt like it, he replied, nodding slowly. It felt like the car finally understood me. Like it stopped resisting. Like we were in sync. Like, it wanted to win just as badly as I did. Vasseur's eyes narrowed slightly, calculating. You've been chasing that feeling all season. Lewis exhaled through his nose, smiling faintly. Yeah. And tonight, For the first time, I didn't feel like I was fighting it. I felt like I was part of it. There was a long pause. Not uncomfortable, contemplative. Vasseur studied him. He could see it now, that intangible quality Hamilton carried when he believed. Not just belief in himself, that was a given, but belief in the machine beneath him, in the people surrounding him, in the mission ahead. And as much as it thrilled him, it also terrified him. Because if Lewis was ascending, Charles was unraveling. The balance of power within Ferrari's most high-profile driver pairing in decades was tilting. Outside the window, the mountains turned indigo. The lights from the Red Bull Ring flickered in the distance. Somewhere out there, victory waited for only one of them. And inside the motorhome, beneath calm words and quiet glances, a fire had already been lit. Would you like to continue with the race day? I can write a full psychological breakdown of Charles's mindset on the grid, or a dramatic incident on lap 1, or a sudden radio call that flips the team dynamics. The motorhome was quiet now, a stillness settling in after the chaos of a relentless race weekend. Inside, the soft hum of electrical equipment blended with the muffled sounds of mechanics finishing up their shifts outside, tools clinking faintly in the distance like fading echoes of battle. The fluorescent lights above cast a gentle, unwavering glow over the room, illuminating two men seated across from each other. Men who, in vastly different ways, carried the weight of an entire legacy on their shoulders. For several moments, neither said a word. The silence between them wasn't awkward, it was loaded. It carried every missed opportunity, every near win, every decision that had been questioned and re-questioned. It carried the pain of technical failures, the sting of missed podiums, the frustration of watching rival teams succeed while they battled issues invisible to the cameras but brutally evident in the data. And it carried something else too, something rarer, something quieter, something deeply personal: mutual respect. Frederick Vasseur exhaled through his nose and leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table, fingers laced, the lines on his face deepened by stress but softened now by sincerity. When he spoke, it wasn't the voice of a team principal delivering a polished message. It was the voice of a man who had seen too much to pretend anymore. "I need you to know something," he said, slowly, deliberately, his French accent slightly more pronounced in the intimacy of the moment. "We've had our doubts this season, many, actually. We've questioned our strategic direction more times than I care to admit. We've torn apart our development schedule. We've looked at our own reflections in the mirror and asked ourselves if we were still the team we believed we were. There have been nights I've gone to sleep wondering if we've lost the plot entirely." His voice caught slightly, not from emotion but from the sheer exhaustion of a season spent perpetually on the back foot. "But one thing," he continued, "the one constant that no one, not the engineers, not the race strategists, not the mechanics nor the leadership has ever doubted, is you. Your experience, your instincts, your presence in that garage. Even on the darkest weekends, even when the results didn't reflect it, even when the media started writing their narratives, internally, you remained the lighthouse. You anchored this team when everything else felt like it was drifting." He paused, making sure the gravity of the words settled. "And after what you did this weekend, the way you extracted performance from that car, the way you worked with the engineers, the clarity of your feedback, the way you rallied the team when morale was on the floor, you changed something. Tangibly. The atmosphere in the garage, the energy among the mechanics, even the young interns who barely speak English, they all saw it. You reminded this team who we are. That we don't just wear red. We fight in red." Hamilton sat still. His hands rested on the edge of the table, fingers tapping lightly against the wood, not from nerves, but from thought. His eyes were fixed on a point somewhere off to the side, his expression unreadable. He wasn't brushing off Vasseur's words. He was absorbing them meticulously, like someone who'd spent far too long surviving on vague encouragement and needed to verify the sincerity behind every syllable. When he finally responded, his voice was softer, almost introspective. "It means more than you probably realize," he said. Hearing that, he paused, not for effect, but because he was sifting through months of emotions: confusion, doubt, anger, loneliness, and moments of fleeting hope. He had walked into Ferrari with the burden of history on his back, and yet he had often felt like an outsider in a cathedral built for others. "This has been hard," he admitted, no longer trying to mask his vulnerability. "Harder than I expected. Not just on the track, but emotionally. There were moments where I questioned whether I'd made the right choice coming here. Whether I could be myself in a place with so much legacy, so much inertia. whether I was here to lead, or just to fill a seat until someone else was ready. He finally looked up and met Vasseur's eyes directly. But today, for the first time since I signed that contract, I felt like I wasn't just visiting Ferrari, I was Ferrari. Not a passenger, not a guest, but part of it. Really part of it. Vasseur nodded, slowly, as if sealing a pact. You are, he said quietly. And tomorrow, we race for more than points. We race to win. All of us. Together. As the evening stretched further into the night and the paddock grew quieter, swallowed by the embrace of the Styrian mountains that surrounded the circuit, the atmosphere shifted. The stars had emerged above the Red Bull Ring, twinkling faintly over the motorhomes and transport trucks lined up like weary soldiers waiting for their next deployment. The buzz of activity had given way to stillness, interrupted only by the occasional laughter of a late-working mechanic or the low rumble of a distant generator. Inside his room, far removed from the scrutiny of cameras and journalists, Lewis sat on a couch near the window, sipping water, still dressed in his team gear but with the collar loosened, his hair slightly messy, his eyes contemplative. His phone buzzed gently beside him. A FaceTime request. The name on the screen was short, simple, and instantly familiar. Toto Wolff. He accepted the call. The screen came to life, revealing Toto seated in a dim room, backlit by the subtle glow of a single lamp. He was wearing his usual black Mercedes team hoodie, the logo visible even in the low light. His expression, however, wasn't the stern tactical look he wore on race weekends. It was warmer, more human. He smiled. Lewis, he said, his voice rich with something between admiration and affection, that was vintage you. Hamilton leaned back against the couch, letting a smile break through his otherwise calm face. He chuckled softly, the kind of laugh that only comes when you've survived something difficult. Felt good, Toto, he replied, letting his guard down. Really good. I needed that. For the next several minutes, they spoke like two old friends who had shared lifetimes in pit lanes, war rooms, and podium celebrations. They spoke of racing lines, of sector splits, of tire wear and brake balance. They reminisced about those unforgettable years of dominance, when everything clicked, when Mercedes wasn't just a team, it was a family. They spoke of the tough times too, of controversies, of Abu Dhabi, of the politics and the pressures that no one outside the paddock could ever fully understand. But eventually, the conversation shifted to something more personal. Toto leaned slightly toward the screen, his voice dropping just a notch. I want to tell you something, he said. I've been watching this season, every lap, every on-board, every interview. And I've seen what you've gone through. I know when a driver isn't being listened to. I know when the garage is split, when trust is fractured. And through all of that, all of it, you've kept your head high. You didn't throw your engineers under the bus. You didn't play politics. You didn't check out. You kept giving everything, even when it felt like no one was giving it back. That's not just professionalism. That's the mark of a champion. And not just on the track. Hamilton blinked slowly. He didn't speak, but Toto could see in his eyes that the words had landed somewhere deep. I'm proud of you, Lewis. Not for the lap times. Not for the quali result. But for how you've carried yourself. That's rare. The call didn't last much longer. There was nothing more that needed to be said. They signed off with a look, a nod, and an unspoken understanding that whatever came next, neither of them was walking away from this chapter unchanged. As the screen faded to black and the stars outside continued to shimmer, Lewis sat alone with the silence. But this time, it wasn't a silence filled with doubt. It was something else, heavier, yes, but somehow steadier. He wasn't done. He wasn't broken. He wasn't backing down. And deep down he knew, somewhere between Maranello and Brackley, between loyalty and legacy, his next chapter was only just beginning. Hamilton didn't answer immediately. There was no rush in his voice, no knee-jerk reaction. He simply sat there, his elbows resting on the edge of a polished carbon fiber desk inside his private room in the Ferrari motorhome, his back straight, posture still. The phone, angled slightly in his palm, illuminated his face in soft white light. His eyes weren't fixed on the camera but off to the side, watching nothing, thinking everything. His expression was unreadable. There was no smile, no frown. Just stillness. Like a man walking a tightrope between memory and instinct, ego and reflection. The silence lasted longer than most would allow. But Toto Wolff didn't interrupt. He understood this version of Lewis, the reflective one. The one who had learned over years of media pressure, corporate maneuvering, and interpersonal chess games to calculate not just what he said, but when he said it. Finally, with a voice low and calm, Hamilton exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding and spoke. "Thanks, man," he said, his tone stripped of bravado, stripped of pretense. There was vulnerability, yes, but also a core of reinforced steel beneath it. "That means more than you know." On the other end of the call, Toto didn't respond right away either. He leaned back in his chair inside the motorhome of Mercedes-AMG Petronas, hundreds of meters away but emotionally far closer, the soft hum of quiet activity in the background. He looked at the screen for a few seconds, almost as if weighing whether to say what had just formed in his mind. Then, with practiced subtlety, he spoke again, voice lower this time but firm. "I'm just saying," he began, trailing off as if to make it sound like a passing thought. But both men knew better. Every sentence in this conversation was deliberate. "If things ever don't work out over there, and I mean really don't, and if your heart ever tells you to come home, we'd always make room. You never stopped belonging here. And you never will." It wasn't a plea. It wasn't even a pitch. It was something softer. Something older. A bridge left unburned. An anchor left buried deep beneath the waves. A reminder that in a world of changing loyalties and corporate masks, there were still people, rare but real, who would wait at the harbor if the storm ever proved too long. Hamilton let the words settle. Not just in the room but inside himself. He didn't smile immediately, nor did he respond with rehearsed diplomacy. His eyes narrowed slightly, as though searching for a feeling that hadn't fully surfaced. Then his mouth curved. Not a grin, not even a smirk, but something smaller. Something private. A softness in the eyes that said, "I hear you." But he didn't say yes. And he didn't say no. What he gave was a pause. A long, deliberate beat of silence, before his voice returned, lower, steadier, and carved from a kind of purpose that doesn't need to be shouted. "Tomorrow," he said, eyes locked on the darkness beyond the motorhome windows, "I need to finish what I started." There was a finality to the words. But not a door closed. More like one delayed. "I need to win," he continued. Then, after a second's breath, in red. There was no defiance in his tone, only clarity. He wasn't saying it for Toto's benefit. He wasn't even saying it for Ferrari, or the journalists waiting with sharpened pens. He was saying it for himself. For the boy from Stevenage who had once dared to dream of Formula One. For the man who had risen through the fire of controversy, collision, victory, and silence. For the competitor who had chosen to walk straight into the lion's den of Maranello not for comfort, but for transformation. Toto nodded slowly. He didn't argue. He didn't try to talk him out of it. He understood what those words meant. He knew Lewis well enough to recognize the line between stubbornness and sacred purpose. So he said nothing more. Just a parting glance. A click. And then the screen went dark. Hamilton set the phone down on the table. The moment the weight of the device left his hand, it was as if something else lifted too. The fog that had clung to him for weeks, the questions, the hesitations, the internal tug-of-war between trust and doubt, had finally cleared. Not because he'd found resolution, but because he had found his center again. He rose from the chair without a word and walked slowly to the glass door that led to the balcony. He slid it open and stepped outside. The air was cooler now, tinged with mountain dew and the metallic echo of machinery being shut down for the night. Below him, the Ferrari trucks glowed faintly beneath tower lights, their red liveries reflecting like molten armor. Beyond them, the paddock slowly wound down, mechanics moving like ghosts in team polos, the distant rumble of generators a constant heartbeat beneath the silence. He placed both hands on the steel railing and stared out into the hills. They were bathed in shadows now, the last trace of twilight swallowed by the coming night. The Styrian Alps loomed like sleeping giants beyond the track, indifferent to human drama, ancient and unmoved. But Hamilton was not unmoved. Inside him, something had taken shape. Not adrenaline. Not anger. Something quieter. Something sharper. Not fire, but focus. Not noise, but intention. The doubts that had whispered to him in the early hours, the tension that had curled in his stomach after every debrief, the invisible weight that had followed him from Bahrain to Barcelona, all of it had dissolved. He wasn't chasing ghosts anymore. He wasn't looking for approval in briefings or for answers in data traces that mysteriously shifted from week to week. He knew what he had. He had the machine beneath him. Flawed, yes, but potent. He had the engineers, not all loyal, but some, and that was enough. He had the skill, the hunger, the clarity. But above all, he had himself. Undiluted, unshaken. Tomorrow was not just another event on the calendar. It wasn't just round 11 of the championship. It wasn't just Austria. It was a line in the sand. A declaration. An act of reclamation. Because for all the politics and whispers and subtle acts of sabotage that might swirl around him, they couldn't sit in the cockpit. They couldn't feel the brake pedal beneath his foot, the steering wheel vibrating with feedback, the engine vibrating through his spine as he approached 320 kilometers per hour. They couldn't think in real time through Eau Rouge or thread the needle through traffic on lap 48. They couldn't feel the balance shift at 4GS or sense the grip returning after a bold tire gamble. They couldn't be him. Only he could. And that was their mistake. They had confused access with understanding, data with depth, statistics with soul. But tomorrow, when the red lights went out and the roar of 20 engines tore through the Austrian morning, it would be his voice in the radio. His hands on the wheel. His instincts, honed by 16 years of triumph and trauma, guiding him through every micro-decision. He would not race for validation. He would not drive for revenge. He would compete because it is in his blood, because when everything else falls away, what remains is the race. And this race, this one, was his. The world would see the red suit, the red gloves, the red car. But inside, something far older, far more powerful, had awakened. Not just a competitor, a storm. And tomorrow, the paddock would realize what it meant to give a lion reason to remember who he is.